I'm going to introduce the panelists in just a minute, and I'm going to be a very moderate moderator. I'm going to try to stay out of the way as much as possible. But I would like to take a minute to celebrate what John DiIulio has just put in front of us. He talked about being a born-again Catholic in the Jesuit tradition. I remember the Jesuits had a center at Georgetown. I used to hang out with them all the time. And once a Jesuit and I had both had a little bit too much to drink, and he leaned over to me and said, "Bill, I'm sure I'm a Jesuit. I'm no longer so sure I'm a Catholic." And I've thought about that for a long time. I've also reflected as an amateur demographer on Professor DiIulio's prayer that 25% of the population would be members of the particular order of nuns who civilized him to the extent that they succeeded in doing so. And, the mind reels at the consequences for Social Security and the rest of our society, but that's just me. Third, you talked about all the good that Catholicism has done as an institution. I'm reminded of a famous story. I think it involved the Bishop of New Orleans, if memory serves, who was asked why the Catholic Church of New Orleans was spending so much time, on Catholic schools, educating people, most of whom weren't Catholic. And he thought for a minute and replied, "We're not educating them because they're Catholic. We're educating them because we're Catholic." And that has stayed with me. That's Catholicism with a capital C and a small c in the very best sense. And finally, you invoked Isaiah Berlin, to explain, this this yin and yang of, Catholicism as the source of good and as the concealer and therefore a better of evil. So I'll turn around and invoke Reinhold Niebuhr, who said famously that original sin is the only demonstrable proposition of the Christian faith. And I think there's a lot to that. Okay, with that as backdrop, let me introduce the panelists, starting with this very familiar gentleman next to me, David Gregory, whose career in journalism began at the age of 18, but it didn't end there. He's best known, I suppose, for his 20 years at NBC News, his 6 years as moderator of Meet the Press, his role as chief White House correspondent during the entire presidency of George W. Bush. But I think it's fair to say that he's here today because of his own spiritual journey, which culminated in the release of a critically acclaimed memoir, How's Your Faith?, which has led him into innumerable fascinating dialogues, some of which I hope we hear about today. Second, Joshua Dubois. He's one of the country's leading experts at the intersection of race, religion, politics, and culture. And for President Obama, he held the same office that John DiIulio did at the beginning of George W. Bush's administration, slightly renamed the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. He wrote the best-selling book, The President's Devotional, and he now runs a social impact agency, a values partnership, where he works with partners from the Gates Foundation to Oprah Winfrey and more to develop community partnerships, and he's been celebrated in numerous publications as one of the real African American leaders of his generation, and rightly so, in my judgment. Russell Moore, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Moore is the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Prior to his election to this role in 2013, he served as provost and dean of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where he also taught as a professor of theology and ethics. He's the author of several books, as you might imagine, including Onward, Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel, and many others. And I think it's fair to say that Dr. Moore is a principled and fearless advocate for religion and religious liberty. And finally, it's my great pleasure to reunite with Katrina Lantos Sweat after too many years. She serves as president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, which was established about a decade ago to continue the legacy of her father, the late, and I would say great, Congressman Tom Lantos, who served as the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the first Holocaust survivor ever elected to the U.S. Congress, and one of the great champions of religious liberty and more broadly human rights in America and around the world. And it is wonderful that you are carrying on and expanding his legacy. Dr. Lantos Sweat is the former chair and vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. She now serves as the co-chair of the board of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, which sounds like really steady work to me, I must say. And also the Budapest-based Tom Lantos Institute, and she also helps spearhead the annual Anne Frank Award and Lecture. I could go on at considerable length, but I should stop there. Some of you, I suspect, have come armed for bear with some things you'd like to put on the table. And so I'm going to begin with a very open-ended question before descending, or in some philosophical traditions, ascending to particulars. Namely, what is it that has drawn you to this issue of religious liberty and has led you to devote so much thought and, in many cases, so much of your lives to this issue? And Katrina, why don't we start with you and move this way?
Well, let me say at the outset what a tremendous honor it is for me to be with such a distinguished group of presenters. And we were encouraged, Dr. Ilulio, to sort of respond, discuss, and have replies to your speech, but it was such a tour de force that I was spending much too much time madly scribbling to really think about probing rebuttals. But if I may, in my sort of opening moments, I'd like to share a couple of stories very briefly that, for me, illustrate the dual dimension of why this fight is worth fighting and winning. This fight for a place for religious freedom at the very center of our civic life. And I think these sort of competing stories, if you will, illustrate the different dimensions, the impact that robust protection for religious freedom can have on society. And equally importantly, perhaps ultimately more importantly, the value of religious freedom and religious integrity to the individual. So about 10 years, well, not 10 years ago, but a few years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Berlin to participate in the OSCE's 10th anniversary conference on the state of anti-Semitism in Europe. And in many ways, it was a pretty sobering and disheartening gathering because, as I'm sure many of you know, anti-Semitism has been on the rise throughout the EU. And as discouraging as the conference was, I had an experience there that really reinforced my conviction that in the long run, history is not kind to those who trample on the religious freedom of others. And what brought this to a head for me was a brief hiatus, a break I took from the conference to go on a tour of Berlin, just an ordinary bus tour. And the tour guide made the following comment. He said that when the Edict of Nantes had been revoked in 1685, that thousands of persecuted Huguenots had fled from France to the city of Berlin, where they ended up becoming really sort of the backbone of the economic and in some senses cultural life of that city. Now, I love to say you will recall that the Edict of Nantes, because I'm rarely in an illustrious enough body where anybody actually recalls the Edict of Nantes. And today may be an exception to that rule, but for those of you who, like myself, don't just have that right at the tip of your fingers, the Edict of Nantes, which was signed in 1598 by Henry IV of France, had granted to the Calvinist Huguenots substantial rights in a country that was overwhelmingly Catholic. And this was sort of a break, really, from the long-standing notion that the religion of a ruler should be able to determine the religion of those who lived within his kingdom, sort of a concept well captured in the Latin phrase, cuius regio eius religio, whose realm, his religion. And so in that sense, we might view the Edict of Nantes as an early advancement, embryonic but nonetheless important, of this idea of the right to freedom of religion and conscience. And its revocation was certainly a huge step backward. But the key point that I would like to emphasize is that by driving the Huguenots out of their land, it was the French who paid a very heavy price on a whole variety of measures. And the city that gave them refuge benefited enormously from their arrival and their inclusion. And honestly, I don't think it's too much of a reach or a stretch for us to think about analogous lessons for us to learn as we today wrestle with ideas about how we welcome those fleeing and how we welcome refugees and those who are being driven out, often for reasons of their faith and their religion. The other story that I'd like to share is a much, much more personal one. It's about my father, who, as was mentioned, was a Holocaust survivor. And when he was a young boy living in Budapest, a young Jewish boy, he was rounded up with all of the male Jewish inhabitants of Budapest. This was before the deportations began, to be taken to a slave labor camp where he was pressed into very difficult and very menial labor. And it so happened that the person in command of the barracks that he was assigned to decided that he would somehow try to burnish, I don't know what, his bona fides, his credentials, his reputation, by getting, which translated as forcing, all of the Jewish boys in this barracks to, quote, convert to Christianity, to prove something. And all of them did, with two exceptions. And one of those exceptions was my father. And I don't know, it's not something my father talked about. The other boy who remained his lifelong friend, who was the other one who refused this compulsory conversion, shared it with us. But I like to think that the character that subsequently formed my father into someone who became such a brave and such a bold defender of the rights of all people sort of began in a way at that moment of truth. Because I think that my father, who was not particularly religious, he had not yet become an agnostic, which he would become later in his life. He had faith, but he was not a particularly religious individual. But I think he understood at a very deep and at a very profound level that his greatest integrity, the underlying dignity of who he was as a person, was implicated in this moment. And somehow he found the strength to value more highly that dignity, that internal freedom of conscience, than he valued his immediate safety and security. And so he refused, and he was very badly beaten for his refusal. But I look back to that moment with enormous pride and as something that strengthens me very deeply. And I think that these two stories, one a historical, one on a macro level, one very personal and very small, and much more immediate, make the case to me that this fight, the fight that the American Charter Project is about, that Dr. Julio has spoken about, that all of us are here gathered to wrestle with, is a fight worth waging. Because if we in any measure abandon our passionate defense of the right of freedom of religion, conscience, and belief for all people on an equal basis, we will have given up something as precious as what my father faced that moment of truth. Would he give that up? And we too must summon the courage. We must be willing to take our beatings in public sometimes to defend that right. So that's why I feel so strongly about these issues, and I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you.
Dr. Moore.
Well, I care about the issue of religious freedom largely because of a very spotty family history. And by that, I mean the family history of my faith community as Baptist Christians. Many religious movements can point back to a beautiful temple or cathedral. Baptists have to point back to prison cells because we have a history of being dissenters, including in the American Republic, where many Baptists in the founding era did prison time when they were required to, for instance, purchase a license to preach, and were told it's really not that much money to pay, which the Baptists replied, it's not a question of how much money, it's a question of who has the authority to demand that sort of money over the soul. And so the example of those early Baptists in Europe and in North America is something that has deeply impressed me, not only as a Baptist, but as an American and as a Christian. And there are a couple of reasons why I think that's crucially important and important for us right now. One is in the area of religion itself. Sometimes I think when we have these conversations about pluralism and civility and freedom, we tend to have people who are at the margins of their faith commitments. So people who believe in a sort of generic spirituality, but don't really believe very much that is all that specific. I am a very conservative, Orthodox Christian. I believe all the things that tend to scare secular people, such as the necessity of being born again in order to enter the kingdom of God. That does not mean, though, that I want to impose my religious views on other people. It means, quite frankly, the reverse. I believe that there is no way that through government edict a soul can be born again. And I think there is no authority that a government has to inhibit or to suppress the free expression of a religion. And so the only thing that a government can do is to turn people into pretend religionists. A government cannot actually change the landscape of the human heart. And so as a Christian, I believe this is fundamentally important for religion. Also think it's fundamentally important for us as Americans, because a state or a culture that can pave over the deepest commitments and convictions of a heart is a state that can do anything. And frankly, even Americans who have no religious commitment at all should be very concerned about protecting religious freedom. We should want the American people to have priorities that transcend the state. It should be best for us if we are a people who are not Americans first in order that we can be Americans best. If all that we have is a commitment to a government or to a state or to a culture, we end up with a divisive and often very violent sort of situation. And so I believe in a limit of the state and a limit of a culture that allows people to come into the public and have genuine and often spirited conversations with one another about things that are quite ultimate, knowing that what is at stake with the alternative. I often quote an old Texas Baptist preacher who used to say, everybody wants theocracy and everybody wants to be Theo. And I think that has proven itself to be true. Whether the authority that people hide behind to impose themselves on others is a religious text, or whether it is a secularizing force of history, the result is not a good one. And so for me, I suppose I would agree with the Archbishop of New Orleans that you quoted some moments ago. I'm for religious freedom not because the American people are Baptists, but because I am.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to Brookings and Baylor for convening this gathering, and to my dear friend John for those powerful remarks. That space between civic toxin and tonic is what I'd love to interrogate just a bit, and perhaps focus a bit less on our first freedoms and ideals, even the critically important freedoms of conscience and exercise of religion that I've spent a fair amount of my career working to advance and protect. Instead, I'm hoping we can spend a bit of time peering into the gaps, the dark spaces between the existence and awareness of our principles and ideals and the ways that people actually live and die in America today. In a time when our energy and our intellectual capacity, indeed even hope, is in short supply, I believe our time is perhaps best spent dealing with those tensions, those gaps. I want to jump into one of them, tell a couple stories as well. Exactly a month and a day ago, I received a frantic call on my cell phone from a member of Congregation Beth Israel in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was a day, of course, when white supremacists mowed down a protester on an American street, with others who were supporting his cause still around him. And there was a day after, an evening where they marched through the University of Virginia with their torches burning, screaming, "Jews will not replace us." My firm had been doing some pro bono work in the days immediately before August 12th, helping Charlottesville Mayor, a good guy named Mike Signer, prepare for what we all knew was going to be a terrible day. And we continue even now to help them pick up the pieces afterward. And I should note, parenthetically, that one thing that gave even greater platform to the terror that led to the loss of that woman's life was the ACLU refusing to allow Mike to move the rally to the edge of town because of their defense of principles. But back to that phone call. So it was a woman on the line when we had a call a couple days before, but now she was frantic and in tears because there was a rumor that folks with Nazi armbands and AR-15 assault rifles were leaving downtown and heading to the temple, which still had people inside. And the question was, what would they do when they got there? We were able to get her some intel from some folks on the ground to sort of give more color and help them prepare. And then Alan Zimmerman, who was the president of the temple, would later tell the fuller story of what happened. Men in fatigues did, in fact, march over, and they stood across the street with their rifles, carrying flags with swastikas on them and shouting Sieg Heil. And it's telling, and as damaging as that would, thank God that was all that they did in that moment. Now, Charlottesville is full, and I mean absolutely full. We've done a ton of work with Monticello on race and slavery and spent a lot of time in that community. It is full of citizens who embody the spirit of civility that we seek to advance here. And perhaps folks who know better than other parts of the country, just, the principles, the first principles of our founders that make our country, at least on paper, strong. And yet, the terror. And yet the fracture that we just saw and experienced as a country, and yet the loss of human life. What do we do in that gap? Briefly, another quick story. I remember just the sickening and odd feeling of participating in a funeral on the floor of a basketball court. I was sitting immediately behind the family, actually behind the coffin, which you didn't really see on TV. You couldn't really get the full effect of the Reverend Clementa Pinckney in Charleston, South Carolina. As the then President of the United States did something that presidents really shouldn't have to do, he delivered a eulogy for Reverend Pinckney. Reverend Pinckney was slain during Bible study, of course, with 8 other parishioners, simply for being black. We've made a lot, we've talked a lot, and I certainly have, of the courageous faith shown by those who forgave the killer, and of President Obama's deeply moving Amazing Grace, but I'm not sure that we fully explored this tension, this gap. What are the cultural forces that could allow that young man to grow up with such antipathy towards other human beings, to the extent that he did not see them as human, and then work out those feelings in such horrific ways? His family shaped him, his church shaped him, the state educated him, the media he consumed motivated him, public policy allowed him to obtain his weapon, and then he crossed not a theoretical church-state threshold, but he crossed the threshold of a church and killed mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers and a pastor named Clemente. Their freedoms could not protect them from a culture and history that killed them. I could go on. I was with First Lady Michelle Obama in Oak Creek, greeting the families of the Sikhs who were slain at their Gurdwara. I remember also sitting at the feet of civil rights giants like Dr. C.T. Vivian and Joe Lowery, folks who are still my friends and mentors to this day, as they explained to me that it was the religious freedom advocates, the civil and moderate and center-left and right pastors who were in fact the most dangerous and destructive to the civil rights cause, because they thought that their first principles and their civility would save them without interrogating the depths of the evil in the human hearts that they saw around them. It was almost a self-indulgent protection for them. It was an opiate that actually slowed justice down. We have to explore the gaps between the profession and clear knowledge of our ideals and the way that people live them out in America every day. How could good Christians, even some of those who wrote down our first freedoms, own human beings like chattel for so long and then lynch them long after that? How can people with strong values and a clear sense of their religious ideals share a workplace or a school or a Walmart with immigrant families and then be okay with sending the children of those families back home to countries they've never known? How can the leader of our country have said and done the things that he's said and done, and then that be okay with so many people? I just want to close with the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. I'm so glad that John mentioned this, the words that he wrote when he was sitting in a Birmingham jail, perhaps one of the most important texts in this space that anyone could read. He was writing to moderate Christian and Jewish leaders who were encouraging him to align more closely with the ideals of the country and to operate with greater civility. They kept saying, we got to have more civility, because they thought that law and principles and civility would be the most effective way of achieving civil rights. Encourage those, again, to read the whole letter, but it says in part, I must make two honest confessions to you, Dr. King said, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate who's more devoted to order principles than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods. King continues, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. That's what's happening now. We're bringing this to the surface. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with. Like a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, injustice must be exposed with all the tension its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of natural opinion before it can be cured. Friends, this is a time when the darkest parts of the human soul are coming to the surface yet again. The answer is not simply civility or the knowledge of our ideals, because we have in fact known them, even written them down in times past, and civility has never saved us. It just makes us feel good while some others suffer. The answer lies in courageously interrogating the gap between our professed ideals and the ways that Americans live their lives, and then working courageously to close that gap. Thank you.
I guess I want to add to this discussion by talking just a little bit about the nature of civic discourse, the ways in which we somehow can reconcile religion and politics and political discourse. And Joshua said some very powerful things that remind me that I think all of our religious traditions require us to interrogate ourselves, right? And what is the real basis of our own humanity? And ask ourselves, what is it that God demands of us as human beings and how we treat one another? And in that way, there are some lines that have to be drawn, and the analogy or the metaphor of the traffic jams and the right of way, that we have to have people who are those signal guards who put up a stop sign or who say, I'm going to draw a line around this and say that this kind of hate is wrong because it's not what God expects of me. We have in the Jewish tradition discussion of the I and thou relationship, and that is that what happens to you matters to me and vice versa, because that's our shared humanity. But these are still hard issues, right? Because even within religious communities, there's a lot of disagreement, as Joshua pointed out, in the civil rights struggle. But isn't it interesting to be in Washington, D.C. during a politically polarized time and talk about religious freedom in a way that we might about other issues? And we can talk about charters, and we can talk about position papers. And I'm a journalist, and I've covered the White House, and I've moderated Meet the Press. But when I talk about faith, even here, I'm led to the sacred. I'm always on the verge of tears. And that's because, for me, it's got to all start with love. And it starts with true humility. So the tonic part of civil discourse is to recognize that we spend way too much time in the public square walking around with this chip on our shoulder, with this sense of certainty that we know and you don't know. What we don't do is very comfortably hold on to our vulnerability and show it to each other and say, you know what, I'm confused. I'm angry. I'm frustrated. And I just don't know what the answer is, but I somehow feel isolated. Because we're not willing to allow ourselves in the social media space to express that kind of doubt. You're not going to get retweeted if you're reflecting the creative tension. You're going to get retweeted, you're going to get resonance if you assert only the righteous path, the sense that I know and that you don't. But it's in holding up that vulnerability and saying, this is where I'm motivated. I'm motivated by this tradition, and I'd like to know what motivates you. And let's have a conversation. And can we have some exchanges around that? We may not be able to agree, but we can get to a place where maybe we can understand some things or understand each other a little bit better. And then there's going to be those areas where I'm going to say, guess what? I may be a journalist, I may be on CNN in the morning, but I'm a Jew. Okay, so for me, the concept of how we talk about immigration, I'm going to see that through my Jewish lens, which is that just, that was me, right? I was in the land of Egypt. And so I've got to remember that when I think about the immigrant. By the way, that jibes so nicely with my Americanness, right? Being in a country of immigrants. And part of my Americanness reminds me I've also got to balance that virtue with protecting the country. And that's why we have a separation of church and state. Can't countenance hate. As a Jew, as a Christian, as a Muslim, or other, or as an American, because we've already been through too much of that in our country, and we've seen what the effects of that are. So to me, I'll state the obvious, which I think we're all here to support, which is I believe in freedom of religion because I believe that people should have as much room as possible to pursue the depth of their own religious tradition and their own spiritual connection with God, so that they can get to a place of bringing that into the rest of their lives as constructively as possible, and that they can share what motivates them with other people. And that if some of that brings some of the humility, to have it be more tonic than be toxic. Because if it starts with a place of, this is where I'm coming from, I don't know what the ultimate answer is. I've got some principles I'm really going to stand on, and I'm willing to fight you about it, peacefully, but I'm going to fight it and I'm going to assert it. Then we can have the debate based on that principle instead of you just don't know and I do. And we got to get more people who are going to, come around to my point of view, and we're going to assert that, and we're going to win in the end. So that's where I think having the freedom matters. Let's allow ourselves to be vulnerable. Let's remember to start out with love. Let's remember humility. Let's remember that everyone has something to give and to contribute in this. And then we can have the dialogue from there.
Well, I hope everybody in this standing room only audience, and this is a sign of real commitment, those of you who've been standing for an hour already in the back of the room, understand just how extraordinary the past half hour has been, how personal, how powerful, and how diverse and how relevant these 4 different testimonies. That's really what they were. 4 different testimonies have been. But I'm going to invite everybody to take up in his or her own way the challenge that Josh Dubois laid down for us. And let me just spend 30 seconds teeing this question up with a personal story of my own. As some of you know, I was a sort of a semi-senior official in Bill Clinton's White House. And on the Domestic Policy Council, one of my beats was religion. I was the Domestic Policy Council's point person on the working group that led up to the enactment and signing of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in the fall of 1993. And I will never forget the scene on the South Lawn of the White House, that glorious fall day when Bill Clinton signed it into law. It was like all of the world's religions had gathered in one space at the same time, but there were no foreign ambassadors. They were all Americans. And, it was such a vivid tableau of not only our diversity, but also our unity. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act passed the House and the Senate of the United States almost unanimously. And 24 years later, here we are. So here's my question, and it's a vague, ill-formed question. I think we all have the sense that we were in one place 24 years ago, and we're in a very different place now when it comes to religious liberty and its role for good and for ill in our civil discourse. So what has happened? What has the itinerary of the country been in this almost quarter of a century that has led us to the current moment? And this is not a university examination. I honestly don't know what the answer is, but I do know that it's a pretty important question.
Do you want us to go down the line, perhaps, or
however you want?
Just kind of discuss it.
Discuss it. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I wanted to say one thing to Joshua, because I so appreciated your phrasing of the gaps and how we have to have the courage to explore those gaps. It made me think of something my late father would often say, which is that, along with the glorious and very inspiring narrative of American history, which he believed quite passionately in, he used to call himself an American by choice. He said the other piece of that is, and another way of understanding our history is as a long and struggling process to close what he called the hypocrisy gap, this extraordinary gap between these magnificent ideals enunciated in our founding documents and the reality. So you're so right that sort of in that purely theoretical, abstract, principled sense, we can miss the boat of what's really happening. But, Bill, the question you ask is a huge one. I think that one of the things I believe we need to hold on to as not only we try to understand how we got here 24 years after the passage of RIFRA, but as we try to figure out our way forward. And that is that as we make what many people will feel strongly is progress in a lot of arenas that have hitherto been untouchable, that relate to bringing people who were previously marginalized and really left out and not included, that we find a way to embrace the good of that without disqualifying and putting on the margins and excluding as unacceptable the very, very deep and sincerely held religious convictions of a huge percentage of our country. I will say that I was dismayed. I was alarmed last week at a Senate hearing for a nominee for a judicial post to have questions coming from senators whom I know and like and respect at many levels, but questions that sounded uncomfortably close to a religious test for office as they probed in a skeptical way and in a almost hostile way the extent to which the nominee that sat before them had orthodox views from her faith tradition. It felt so wrong. It felt so troubling. And so I think that as we struggle towards new consensus on public policy about certain issues that open up our shared public civic space to people to whom it should always have been open, and as we make that very important progress, that we not view that as an excuse or an opportunity to begin to delegitimize members of our shared civic community and members of our family, our shared family. We don't disqualify them and we don't delegitimize them because of their faithful and sincere adherence to their deeply held beliefs.
I think if we just define this as whether people are entitled to their beliefs, then we're missing some of the nuance of what has deteriorated over time. I mean, to me, what I'm struck by is the amount of self-righteousness about how religion inserts itself into the public square. And by that I mean those who are not religious. Secularists have a self-righteousness and an ignorance about them, about faith, because they think that people of faith are rigid, are orthodox, and are trying to shove a certain lifestyle down their throat, and therefore they don't want to hear discussion. I think some of the more conservative and the orthodox tend to think of other people along the continuum as somehow having, as you said, Russell, kind of very marginal religious commitments that may not be quite as authentic. So one of the things that I think has to assert itself in the public square, in politics, is progressive theology. I don't think it has gotten quite as much attention. I don't think there's quite as much glue as there is with orthodoxy, and of all stripes. And I think that turns a lot of people off. And I don't think it should, because I think what we lack is a proper vocabulary of religious meaning and purpose, and how rooting ourselves as individuals in our religious practice and tradition gets us closer to our best selves. And that's what organizes us in ways. So if my synagogue, we're talking about social activism around immigration, that's a good thing. Now, there may be people who disagree about some of the remedies, but that's only a good thing, as long as it doesn't devolve into we know and you don't know, we're the only right ones and you're all wrong. And I think, so to me, that's part of the deterioration, that we don't have much room to live in some space of tension.
I think it's a great question, and I'm not sure it's been a deterioration as much as there among the communities where there's the greatest tension. I'm just not sure there was ever a real relationship at all. And so you are now seeking to navigate big, tough issues without any base of relationship and trust. Let's take the between these communities. So for example, the conservative evangelical community and the women's community, or conservative evangelical community and the LGBT community. For the last 20 years, if not longer, they have not been talking with one another. Some perceived that they weren't allowed to talk with one another, that there would be so much sanction from their own communities that these rooms could not come together. And so now when when the big issues are in front of us, there's no base of relationship there to navigate those issues. And it's hard to play catch up when communities believe that the other side has denied their dignity for so long, and so why would they come to the table now? And so again, I'm not sure that it's been a downward slide as much as it's sort of rooted in almost a complete lack of relationship for years, and now at the time when relationship is needed, perhaps more than ever, it doesn't exist, and the stakes are so high, it's tough coming together. And one last thing I'll mention, more in the global context, but also here at home as well, and it's going to sound crazy, but I think men are a big part of the problem. Who leading the charge in terms of ISIS fighters that are robbing others of their human dignity and religious liberty? Who did you see marching by and large at UVA and in Charlottesville? There's I think a toxic vision and understanding of masculinity and of feeling threatened and having to reassert oneself in really dangerous and problematic ways, and define oneself on the basis of your ability to convince others of what you believe. That again, I'm no sociologist, I can't exactly point to the cause, but somehow this conversation around what it means to be a man, both here in the United States and around the globe, I think we've got to insert gender into this. So it's not all about religion, it's about things like relationship, like gender, that become a part of this toxic brew. Yeah.
I liked John DiIulio's metaphor of road traffic and road rage, because I immediately thought of a study several years ago by Colorado State University trying to predict road rage. And what they found in the study is that one cannot predict road rage on the basis of the age of the driver, on the basis of the make or model of the automobile. Really, the only predictor for road rage at all was the presence of bumper stickers. And it didn't matter what the bumper stickers say. Whether or not it was practice random acts of kindness or my kid can beat up your honor student, just the presence of the bumper stickers. And the more bumper stickers, the more likely the person was to engage in road rage. And of course, they didn't have data to explain why, but they speculated this is probably because the psychology of the sort of person who says, I want to telegraph my viewpoints on these issues to random strangers on the road tends to lend itself to a certain sort of passion that comes with that. I think that's what has happened largely in the American public square, which I believe comes from a loss of transcendence in American public life. When there is not a sense of transcendent purpose and meaning, people are going to try to find substitutes for that. And what we have largely seen happening in American life is people finding tribal identities in political movements or cultural arguments in a way that often really isn't about coming to a solution to those arguments, but about identifying, I am the sort of person who stands here, as opposed to the sort of people who stand there. I think that happens across the spectrum, and I think it has everything to do with what's happening in terms of religion. For instance, I often find when I'm talking to people on the progressive left who disagree with me on matters of religion, that often there is an assumption that religion is going to go away. And so if there's just enough cultural or political pressure put upon religious believers of whatever stripe, we're just going to nudge you along to where you're going to be anyway. That is demonstrably not the case around the world right now. But I also find that people in my own tribe, in conservative Christianity, have also acculturated to this sense of statecraft as ultimate. So, for instance, I had a conservative Christian say to me one time, why do we need to talk about religious liberty? Let's stop talking about defensive measures and go on offense. And what I said was, what you're assuming is that what is a fence and what is moving the goal down toward the target can only be done by the state. When we're Christians, we believe that the most important reality that we have is the gospel and is the mission of the church. But there's an assumption that that doesn't matter as much as achieving some legislative wins. I think that's been a loss in American life across the board.
And I would just add, I mean, that's why I think I agree with Dr. Moore exactly, because I think, it's in faith communities that are experiencing their own struggles for existence and for thriving that they have to find a way of bridging all of the differences within the faith communities to give people a sense of purpose and meaning, and so that they can coalesce around whether it's activism or kind of shared sentiment. And that's why, again, I think vocabulary is important, a vocabulary of inclusiveness that doesn't make people avoid people of faith.
We have a few minutes left in this event for questions from the floor, and I see a sea of hands in the same place. Interesting. There's a woman on the aisle with her hand up, if the roving mic can reach her, and then I see a couple of others in roughly the same place.
Good morning. My name is Leslie Cosgrove. I'm with Amaranth Village, and I am thrilled to hear you talk about civic toxics and toxins, because I was afraid that we weren't going to get to real people, local level, communities level, more at the policy issue level here today. I work primarily in Africa at the moment, but I also work in Philadelphia and other environments. We've talked theoretically about what those toxins and toxics are, but we haven't really talked about the strategies on how to work with people at the local village and community levels in our neighborhoods on how to bring that together. Just some of the last comments you've made indicated, the American viewpoint, but where I'm working, the religious issues become economic issues, government issues, political issues, and people are very clear about what their religion supposedly is, right? And they become barriers. But I think that the same strategies are probably the same, okay?
I'm going to take that as a question.
Yes, please.
Whoever would like to respond to it, and not everybody has to respond to each question.
Sure. It's a great point and question. I think people are very clear until they aren't, until they approach the question with a degree of humility that perhaps they did not have before, as David was saying. And we've done some work, for example, on maternal and child health on the African continent, and in context with religious leaders that are not inclined to a conversation about, for example, maternal mortality. Until you build relationship and slowly work your way into that conversation. And then barriers that are initially assumed to be because of faith reveal themselves to be because of other things, sometimes misunderstanding, sometimes gender dynamics that need to be further explored. And sometimes those barriers can come down, but beginning with relationship and then really bold conversation. I think I was a little down on civility, but I do think there's a space for an active civility, a lived civility. Oftentimes we assume that civility means being silent. It means being, just quiet and nice and humble and so forth. But when you see something that's wrong, or when you see something that you just know in your gut is a violation of some of these first principles, we need sort of boldly and actively civil people to speak into that. That doesn't mean you have to scream into it. It doesn't mean you have to, violate community and human norms and while you do so. But I think having the courage to have those tough conversations and is a big part of the answer. So hopefully that addresses your question.
Thank you. There is a hand at the end of the very same row. That gentleman there.
Hi, I'm Nick Little. I'm the legal counsel for the Center for Inquiry, a secular humanist organization representing the plurality of Americans that are non-religious, that have no religious affiliation. And we've talked about pluralism, and it's been very much on the basis of within religion. And nobody has mentioned how you reach out to the fastest growing, the plurality of Americans that have moved away from organized religion on this. How do we do that? How do you bring us to the table to work with you on this when we see, for example, the president stand up and say, Americans don't worship government, they worship God? And we didn't hear a single voice from, in particular, the conservative religious groups turning around and saying, hey, no, maybe there are many Americans that don't worship God. How do you bring us to the table?
A fair and necessary question.
Well, I think some of us up here at the table today have, I think, tried to convey the power of storytelling in a way to change how people see a situation. And I think, not in the American context, but in the international context, about the incredibly compelling story of a young man in Saudi Arabia, Raif Badawi, who some of you may know of, who, for the crime of being an agnostic, of not having orthodox beliefs within that very theocratic society, has been sentenced to 10 years in prison and was originally sentenced to 1,000 lashes, which were intended to be administered at the rate of 20 a week. It was sort of a slow motion death sentence. And I do think that compelling stories like Raif that show such integrity, such personal courage in defense of his conscience rights, his ultimate beliefs. I think in the charter, the American charter that's sort of getting a soft launch today, it talks about us needing to have a deep reverence, which may sound like a religious word, but it shouldn't be a religious word. It should be a civic word. We need to have deep reverence for the ultimate beliefs of all people, because we know, we sense, we feel in our own gut that it goes to the very essence of our humanity, to the very essence of our dignity. And so I mean, I think you're raising a really tough question, because we are a religious nation for the most part. It is changing. I'm a very religious person, but I was so moved by Raif Badawi's story. And I think that, we see a lot of the progress that was made for, gay rights came out of storytelling, not standing on soapboxes and arguing exclusively from principle, but sort of building relationships, as Joshua says, and telling stories. And so it's not a policy answer, but I think it's a piece of that puzzle, is opening the eyes of more religiously inclined fellow citizens to the conviction and the integrity and the personal devotion of those whose beliefs are secular or humanist or agnostic or atheist. And that builds that common bridge of shared admiration. And it works best when it's a two-way street.
I don't want to practice geographical discrimination, so I see a hand in the back of the room, and that, unfortunately, given the constraints of time, will have to be the last question, and then I'll briefly wrap up. Yes, ma'am.
I'm trying to see how to pose this question, so I'll start like this. One, I think somebody said, how do you bring certain people to the table? So I'm just saying we want black churches brought to the table. Somebody said it up there, because we need to be a part of what you all are doing. And somebody said, how do you build a base of trust in communities? It's more people need to be involved, because we're still separated. Churches are separated against churches. Just like you said, the Baptists, well, guess what? I'm Pentecostal. So I don't know who wants me. I don't know who wants me at the table. Okay, and so I thought about Dr. Stanley here, who has started a movement of bringing black churches together, and they've had a couple of sessions. But I would love to see it at a higher level, Dr. Stanley, when we have the people at the table up here, and we get the convention center or something, because we have so much to talk about, and it's so much separation. And I just want to know, how can we get you all to bring us to the table? That's my question.
It's a great point. I'd love others to speak to this as well, but I just would just agree that black churches do need to be at the table. There's some of the folks for whom religious liberty matters most have been some of the great defenders, and the Rivers family here has been doing tremendous work in that space, helping the black church have conversations around religious liberty. But would just affirm your point.
Yeah.
I would also just like to say that it's not only that the black church is essential in terms of religious freedom as a principle, but also because the black church can teach the rest of America how to answer some of the previous questions that have been asked here already. Reverend Rivers mentioned Martin Luther King and the 50th anniversary of his assassination next year. What strikes me about Dr. King that we need the most right now is the fact that Dr. King was not in his writing, in his speaking, he was not speaking only to those who were already with him. He was speaking to my grandfather in Mississippi, who that he never saw as being anything less than a potential convert to his cause and to his way of seeing things. That's one of the great problems that we have in American life across the board, is that we don't ultimately believe that we're going to be able to persuade one another of anything, and so we assume that all we can do is to push one another into their categories and to speak about them rather than speak to them.
Can I just
King,
make
though,
one
spoke
point?
to the conscience. I think that's an important point.
Russell, you mentioned tribalism before in American politics and how religion intersects with American politics. I think there's work that can be done with leaders like all of you, with media as a community, to help educate and to help develop the language of faith so that it is not so foreign in the discourse of media, so that there can be real informed dialogue about religious difference, about no religion at all, about the full spectrum here of a pursuit of meaning and purpose, and that you can go to efforts to really knock down those walls by convening together, churches, black churches and otherwise gathering together, but trying to raise the level of education of those in the media about the world of faith and why it is so motivating for people to bring it into the public square to really good ends, and not allow the media to take it as just a way to further polarize people. So I think it's a really kind of outward-facing mission, too, for the Charter.
This brings us to the end, and in about 2.5 minutes, I'd like to do a number of things simultaneously. First of all, following on what David Gregory just said, I would like to note with deep sorrow the recent passing of Michael Cromartie, whose project Faith Angle did more to bring awareness of religion and knowledge of religion into the press corps and to coverage of religion than anybody else in the country, by far. And by God, do we need him now? And I hope very much that somebody will pick up that mantle. I miss him. Second, but not last, I think that our keynote speaker, John DiIulio, and the 4 panelists here have been extraordinarily generous, honest, humble, giving, and illuminating. And I think we all owe them not only a debt of gratitude, but a round of applause for their contributions. Third, I'd like to thank Josh Dubois in particular for unraveling one of the many mysteries embedded in John DiIulio's speech, the idea of the toxicity of religion. And you've explained it in 2 very simple words: testosterone poisoning. Fourth, I spent 30 years as a college professor, so you'll have to forgive me for adding to your reading assignment. We've already heard about Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, but as I heard Dr. Moore speak, I was reminded all over again of one of my favorite documents in American political history, namely James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, which laid out what we all have been talking about in terms so clear and unmistakable that I think every American should reacquaint him or herself with that document. I'd like to end. The benediction will be the very last words that Franklin Roosevelt ever wrote, and he died before he had a chance to deliver them. They would have been the conclusion of his final radio address. He said, "Let us move forward with a firm and active faith." Amen. And thank you.